woman chose death over going home, until a stranger carried her through hell. The woman lay dying in the snow, with the blizzard howling around her, like the fury of God himself, and the cowboy almost rode past without seeing her, would have ridden past if his horse hadn't stopped and refused to move, ears pricked forward toward something half buried in the white that looked like a fallen log, but was actually a human being, freezing to death 15 miles from anywhere. His name was Jacob Thorne, and he was 38 years old, and he'd been riding for the McAllister Ranch, checking the northern fence line when the storm hit. Came out of nowhere the way storms did in these mountains, rolling in from the peaks like a living thing with teeth made of ice and claws made of wind, and he'd turned for home immediately because he knew what blizzards could do, how they'd claimed the lives of experienced ranchers and seasoned travelers who'd made one wrong turn or misjudged the distance to shelter. His mare, a tough little Mustang he'd named Sage for her gray coat, had been steady through worse weather than this, but something about this storm felt different, felt malevolent in a way that made Jacob's gut tighten with primal fear. The kind of fear that came from understanding you were facing something that wanted to kill you and had all the tools necessary to do it. If you love stories about survival against impossible odds, about strangers who become everything to each other, about love forged in the crucible of life and death, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the Old West, where the stakes were always high and the bonds formed in crisis lasted forever. Sage had stopped here and wouldn't budge, and now Jacob saw why. Saw the shape that wasn't quite right, wasn't natural in the uniformity of the snow. And he dismounted fast, his boots sinking into snow that came up past his knees, making every movement labored and exhausting. And when he reached the shape and knelt down and brushed away the accumulation with hands already going numb, he found a woman. She wore no coat, just a thin dress that might have been blue once, but was now soaked through and crusted with ice crystals. And her lips were purple, bordering on black, and her skin was white as the snow around her, with a waxy quality that spoke of blood that had stopped circulating properly. And he knew she had maybe minutes left before hypothermia finished. What exposure had started. Knew that every second he delayed decreased her already slim chances of survival. He pulled off his heavy sheepskin coat without thinking, just reacting on instinct and years of frontier training that said you helped people in trouble, because next time it might be you who needed help. And he wrapped it around her and said, "Ma'am, can you hear me?" But she didn't respond, didn't even flutter her eyelids, and her breathing was so shallow he had to press his face close to her mouth to confirm she was still breathing at all. Just the faintest whisper of warmth against his frozen cheek. Her hands, when he touched them, felt like ice. Actually felt colder than the snow itself. Felt like touching stone that had been buried in permafrost. And Jacob rubbed them, trying to generate friction and heat. But his own hands were already going numb from exposure, and he knew he had to get her on the horse and get moving, or they'd both be corpses by morning. Frozen solid and not found until spring, thaw revealed what winter had claimed. Lifting her was harder than he expected, because unconscious bodies are dead weight, because they don't help or adjust or cooperate in any way. And the deep snow made footing treacherous, and his own body was already weakening from cold. But he got her up through sheer determination. Got her draped across Sage's saddle, positioned her so she wouldn't slide off, and then he pulled himself up behind her, with arms that trembled from effort and cold, holding her against his chest with one arm, while the other hand held the reins loose, because he was trusting Sage to find the way home through the white void that surrounded them. The storm was getting worse, visibility dropping from maybe 20 feet to maybe 5, the wind increasing to a sustained howl that drove snow horizontally hard enough to sting exposed skin. And Jacob held the woman close, sharing what warmth he had left, because his coat was on her now, and the wind was cutting through his shirt like it was made of paper instead of wool, cutting through to the bone, making him gasp with the shocking cold of it. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, could feel his thoughts starting to slow and fragment the way they did when your body temperature dropped, when your brain started shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the core. And he knew that was dangerous, knew that was the beginning of the end, knew that was how people died in storms. They just got tired and decided to rest and never woke up, slipped away into sleep that became death. So gradually, they never noticed the transition. So he talked to keep himself alert, talked to the woman, and to Sage and to himself, said, "Just a little farther. We're almost there. Just keep going. Don't stop. Never stop." And his words came out slurred and slow, but he kept talking anyway, because silence felt like death, felt like acceptance of defeat. And he wasn't ready to accept anything, except that they would make it home somehow. Time became meaningless in the white void, became just the endless repetition of one moment after another. The cold and the wind, and the effort of staying upright on the horse and keeping the woman from sliding off. And Jacob lost track of how long they'd been riding. Could have been an hour or 3 hours or 10 minutes. He had no way to know, because the storm erased all sense of progression, made it feel like they were standing still while the world spun around them. His hands had stopped hurting, which was bad, because that meant the nerves were shutting down. Meant frostbite was setting in. Meant he might lose fingers if they survived this. And his face felt numb and distant, like it belonged to someone else. And several times he started to slide sideways and caught himself at the last second, jerking back to awareness just before falling. And he knew that if he fell, he wouldn't get back up, would just lie there in the snow until the cold finished him. But Sage kept walking, kept putting one hoof in front of another, with the steady determination of a creature that knew where she was going, even if her rider didn't, trusting instincts that humans had lost or never had. And somewhere in the white void, a darker shape appeared, indistinct at first, but gradually solidifying into the outline of a building with walls and a roof. And Jacob's exhausted brain took several seconds to process that this was the ranch house, that Sage had brought them home through conditions that should have killed them all, that they'd made it against odds that had been stacked heavily against them. He half fell from the saddle, his legs barely supporting his weight when his feet hit the ground, and he dragged the woman with him, catching her before she hit the snow. And the 50 feet to the door felt like 50 miles, felt like crossing a desert or climbing a mountain. Every step an act of will, but he made it, stumbling and weaving like a drunk, but making forward progress. And he kicked the door open and carried her inside, and laid her on the floor near the fireplace, that still held embers from this morning. Faint orange glow. That was the most beautiful thing Jacob had ever seen, because it meant heat, meant life, meant they had a chance. His hands shook so badly, he could barely strike a match. Dropped 3 before finally getting one lit, and the simple act of holding a match steady enough to light kindling felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. But he managed it. Watched the small flame catch and spread, added more kindling and then larger pieces, and finally logs, and smoke rose and heat began to spread slowly, painfully slowly, filling the room with warmth that felt like a physical presence after the brutal cold of the storm. Warmth that hurt almost as much as the cold had, because frozen tissue coming back to life brought pain that was excruciating. The woman lay motionless, still wrapped in his coat, her face pale as death, and for several minutes Jacob just sat there, trying to get his own body temperature back to something approaching normal, trying to make his hands and face work again, trying to think clearly through the fog that hypothermia had wrapped around his brain. When he finally had enough mobility back to be functional, he turned his attention to her, and he pressed his fingers to her throat, searching for a pulse, and found it. Faint, but there. A flutter, like a bird's heartbeat, irregular and weak but present, and relief flooded through him so intense it was almost painful, followed immediately by terror. Because alive didn't mean safe, didn't mean she'd survive the next hour or the next day, didn't mean the hypothermia hadn't already done damage that would kill her slowly over the coming hours. Her clothes were soaked through completely, ice forming in the fabric where water had frozen, and Jacob knew he had to get her warm and dry, or hypothermia would finish what the blizzard had started. So he stripped off the wet dress, with the hands that felt like blocks of wood, fingers that wouldn't bend properly or grip reliably, trying to focus only on survival, on the medical necessity of what he was doing, on the fact that modesty meant nothing when death was the alternative. The dress came off in pieces, the fabric so frozen it cracked when he bent it, and underneath her skin was marble white and cold as stone, mottled with patches of dangerous-looking purple and blue that spoke of blood that wasn't circulating properly, of tissue that was on the edge of dying, and Jacob felt a spike of fear that he was too late, that she'd been exposed too long, that all his effort would end with her dying anyway. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, wool and quilted cotton, and a bearskin that had been his grandfather's, piling them on until she was cocooned in layers that would trap what little body heat she had left and gradually warm her. And he pulled her closer to the fire, but not too close, because he knew rapid rewarming could cause problems, could shock the system, could do more harm than good. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, trying to bring blood back to extremities that felt frozen solid, and for a long time nothing changed. She didn't wake and didn't warm, and her breathing stayed shallow and irregular, and Jacob began to think he'd saved her from the snow only to watch her die in his house, and that seemed worse somehow. Seemed like a crueler ending than freezing alone in the storm. Seemed like false hope was worse than no hope at all. He made coffee, strong and bitter, heating water on the stove that he kept going along with the fireplace, and when it was ready he tried to get some into her mouth, tilting her head back and dribbling the hot liquid past her lips, drop by drop, and most of it ran out. But some went down, and he counted that as progress, counted anything that wasn't death as a small victory worth celebrating. The night stretched out endless and dark, the storm raging outside with a fury that rattled windows and shook walls, wind screaming around the eaves like something alive and angry that they'd escaped it. And inside, Jacob maintained his vigil, feeding the fire every hour, checking her pulse every few minutes, monitoring her breathing and her color, and any small sign that might indicate improvement or decline. Around midnight, her color started to improve slightly, the deathly white fading to something that might actually be skin tone, pale, but not corpse-like, and her lips lost some of their purple hue, becoming more pink than blue, and Jacob felt hope kindle in his chest, small and fragile but real, the first genuine hope he'd allowed himself since finding her. He changed the blankets that had gotten damp from her wet skin and the moisture her body released as it began to warm, replaced them with dry ones from his bedroom. And he noticed her fingers were less rigid, could be bent slightly without feeling like they'd snap, and he took that as another good sign, evidence that circulation was returning, that her body was fighting back against the cold that had nearly killed her. Around 2 a.m, her eyes opened, just fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and confused, pupils dilated in a way that concerned Jacob, but at least responding to the firelight. And she looked at him without seeing him, looked through him more than at him, and then her eyes closed again, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. But that brief moment gave Jacob hope, gave him reason to believe she might actually survive this, that her brain hadn't been damaged beyond repair. He dozed, sitting up in his chair next to her, jerking awake every time the fire needed feeding, or his body convinced itself she'd stopped breathing, and the night crept forward with the particular slowness that comes when you're waiting for something you can't control, when time becomes both enemy and ally. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under 3 feet of fresh snow that covered everything in pristine white, and the rising sun turned it all gold and pink and beautiful in a way that felt almost obscene, given what the storm had nearly done. Jacob stood at the window looking out at the aftermath, and thought about how many people might have died in the night, how many travelers or ranchers caught out in it, and he felt guilty for surviving when others probably hadn't, felt the survivor's burden of being lucky. Behind him, the woman stirred, the first voluntary movement he'd seen from her, and he turned to find her eyes open and staying open this time, tracking him as he crossed the room, awareness in them that hadn't been there before, consciousness that looked fragile but real. She looked around the cabin with an expression of complete bewilderment, taking in the rough log walls and the stone fireplace and the animal hides, and when she saw Jacob, she flinched back instinctively, fear flashing across her face like lightning. And Jacob held up his hands in a gesture of peace and said, "Easy, you're safe. I found you in the storm yesterday. You were freezing to death." His voice was hoarse from exhaustion and disuse, rough as sandpaper, and the woman stared at him for a long moment, processing this information, trying to reconcile where she was with where she last remembered being. And then she looked down at herself, at the blankets covering her, and understanding dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by embarrassment and something darker, something that looked like shame or fear or both. And she pulled the blankets tighter around herself and said, "Where are my clothes?" And her voice was barely more than a whisper, throat raw from exposure. Jacob gestured to the dress hanging near the fire, still damp despite hours of drying, and he said, "They were soaked through. Frozen, actually. You would have died if I hadn't got them off you and got you warm. I'm sorry if that troubles you, but it was that or let you die, and I couldn't do that." The woman nodded slowly, accepting this explanation, and then she said, "Thank you." And the words carried weight that went beyond politeness, carried the understanding that he'd saved her life, that she'd been minutes from death when he found her. And Jacob just nodded and said, "What were you doing out there? In a storm like that with no coat? You got about 15 miles from the nearest town." The woman's face clouded, and she looked away, looked at the fire instead of at him, and said, "Running." And that one word held more story than Jacob had asked for, held implications of violence and desperation and choices made in crisis. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and over the next several days, as she recovered her strength, as color returned fully to her face, and feeling returned to her fingers and toes that had come dangerously close to frostbite, she told Jacob her story in pieces, fragments shared during meals, or while sitting by the fire in the evenings, when the light was low and speaking felt safer somehow than it did in daylight. She'd been married to a man named Richard Marsh, a merchant in Silver Creek, who owned the general store and had a reputation as a respectable businessman. Pillar of the community, deacon in the church, all the markers of respectability that made people trust him and respect him and never question what happened behind closed doors. For the first year, it had been tolerable. Not happy, but survivable. Richard had been demanding and controlling, but not violent. Had wanted things done his way, but hadn't hurt her for failing to meet his standards. And Eleanor had told herself she could live with that. Had told herself that marriage was compromise, and she just needed to learn how to be what he wanted. But then Richard had started drinking. Not heavily at first, just a glass or two in the evening. But the amount crept up, and his temperament changed with it, became volatile and unpredictable. Became the kind of dangerous where she never knew what would set him off. The violence had started small, just a grabbed arm that left bruises shaped like fingers, a shove that sent her into a wall hard enough to leave a mark. Things he could explain away, as accidents if anyone noticed. Things he could blame on her clumsiness. And Eleanor had made excuses for him at first. Told herself he was under stress from business or finances. Told herself it would get better once things improved. But it didn't get better. It got worse. Escalated over 2 years until the grabbed arms became slaps that left her face burning, and the slaps became punches that left her with black eyes and split lips, and the punches became beatings that left her barely able to stand. Broken ribs and bruises that covered her torso like a map of violence. And through it all, Richard maintained his public image, was charming and generous in town. Greeted people with smiles and handshakes, made donations to church causes, and sponsored community events, and nobody suspected that the respectable Mr. Marsh went home and terrorized his wife. Eleanor had tried to tell the sheriff once, had gathered her courage and gone to him with bruises visible on her face and wrists, and the sheriff had listened and nodded and said he'd talk to Richard about it. And Richard had come home that night in a rage worse than any she'd seen before, and beaten her so badly she couldn't walk for 3 days. And he'd told her if she ever told anyone again, he'd kill her. Said he'd make it look like an accident, and everyone would believe him, because he was Richard Marsh, upstanding citizen, and she was just his wife, who everyone knew was clumsy and accident-prone. 3 days ago had been the breaking point, the moment when Eleanor's survival instinct finally overrode her fear, and the conditioning that said wives stayed with husbands no matter what. Richard had come home drunk and angry about something at the store. Some customer who'd questioned a price, or some supplier who'd been late with a delivery, and he'd taken it out on Eleanor with fists and boots, had beaten her so badly she'd lost consciousness, and when she woke up hours later, on the kitchen floor with blood in her mouth and ribs that screamed when she breathed, she understood with perfect clarity that if she stayed, he would kill her. Not might kill her, but would kill her. Maybe tonight, or maybe next week. But eventually, inevitably, he would go too far, and she would die. So she'd waited until he passed out in his chair, waited until his snoring filled the house, with the sound of his unconsciousness, and she'd grabbed nothing, taken nothing, but the dress she was wearing. Hadn't even thought to take a coat, because thinking clearly wasn't possible through the pain and fear and adrenaline, and she'd just run, fled into the night without plan or preparation, just pure instinct, driving her away from the man who'd promised to love her, and had instead tried to destroy her piece by piece. The storm had caught her 10 miles from town, caught her unprepared and inadequately dressed, and she'd kept walking because stopping meant freezing, and she'd rather die free than go back to Richard. Had made that calculation consciously and decided death was preferable to one more day of living in terror. The cold had overwhelmed her eventually, had simply been too much for a body that was already damaged and exhausted, had put her down in the snow like a hand pushing her to her knees and then to her side, and she remembered the strange warmth that came near the end, the way freezing to death stopped hurting and started feeling almost pleasant, and she'd been slipping into that final sleep when Jacob found her, had been maybe 5 minutes from death when his horse stopped and refused to move. Telling Jacob this story over several days, watching his face stay carefully neutral, but seeing the anger flash in his eyes when she described Richard's violence, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, felt the shame that Richard had cultivated start to crack and fall away, because Jacob's reaction made clear that what had happened wasn't normal and wasn't her fault, that the violence wasn't something she'd earned or deserved, but something that had been done to her by a man who should have protected her. Jacob listened without interruption, his hands occasionally clenching into fists that revealed his anger, even though his face stayed controlled. And when she finished, he said, "You can stay here as long as you need. Storm's past, but the snow's too deep for safe travel anyway, and you're not strong enough yet regardless. You'll be safe here. I give you my word on that." Eleanor looked at him with an expression that held both gratitude and suspicion. Gratitude for the offer, and suspicion because in her experience, men didn't offer help without expecting something in return, without viewing it as a transaction that entitled them to something. But Jacob just stood and went about his business, feeding the fire and checking his horses, and doing the 100 small tasks that ranch life required. And he didn't ask for anything, and didn't expect anything, and didn't try to collect payment for the rescue or the shelter. And slowly over days and then weeks, Eleanor began to believe that maybe he was different. Maybe not all men were like Richard. Maybe there existed in the world men who could be kind without expecting submission in return. Days turned into weeks, and the snow melted slowly, revealing a world transformed by winter, brown grass and bare trees gradually emerging from white, and Eleanor grew stronger both physically and mentally, the bruises fading and the broken ribs healing, and something inside her that Richard had damaged starting to repair itself. She helped with chores around the cabin, cooking meals and mending clothes, and doing the domestic work that made isolation more bearable. And a routine developed between them that was comfortable and companionable. Two people sharing space without friction or tension, just existing together in the vastness of the mountains. Jacob taught her to ride, taking her out on his spare horse once the weather improved enough for it to be safe, and Eleanor took to it naturally, sitting the saddle like she'd been born to it, finding in the movement and the freedom something she hadn't known she was missing. And they'd ride the perimeter of his property, and he'd show her landmarks and tell her stories about the land and the people who'd tried to settle it, about failed mines and abandoned cabins, and the harsh reality of trying to make a living in country that fought back against every attempt to tame it. She'd listen and ask questions, and gradually the haunted look faded from her eyes, replaced by something that might have been peace, or might have been the beginning of happiness, the first genuine lightness she'd felt in years. Spring came late to the mountains, but it came, snow melting into rushing streams that carved new paths, wildflowers carpeting the meadows in waves of color. And Eleanor had been with Jacob for 3 months, and the question of what happened next hung unspoken between them. Because staying forever wasn't practical unless they made it official somehow. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eleanor said, "I should go. You've done enough for me, more than enough. You've given me time to heal, and that's more than I had any right to expect." And Jacob was quiet for a long moment, so long that Eleanor thought maybe he agreed, but then he said, "You could stay, if you wanted. This place is big enough for 2. More than big enough, actually." The offer hung in the air, carrying implications neither were ready to name directly. And Eleanor looked at him and saw in his face something she hadn't seen in years. Saw kindness and respect, and maybe the beginning of something deeper. And she said, "I'd like that." And those 3 words changed the trajectory of both their lives, turned a temporary arrangement into something permanent. Richard Marsh came looking for her in late spring, when the roads were finally passable again, rode up to Jacob's property with 2 hired men and a self-righteousness that came from believing absolutely in his own narrative. Jacob was in the barn when they arrived, came out when he heard horses, and he saw 3 men sitting their mounts in front of his house, with Richard in the center, looking every inch the respectable merchant out to reclaim his property. And Jacob came out onto the porch with his rifle, not pointed at anyone, but held ready. Held in a way that made clear it could be pointed very quickly if needed. Richard spoke first, his voice carrying the assumed authority of a man used to being obeyed. Said, "You're harboring my wife. I want her back. Now." Jacob looked at him for a long moment, taking his measure, seeing the type of man he was dealing with, the type who'd use law and custom and social pressure to get what he wanted. And Jacob said, "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." The words were simple but carried weight, carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd made a decision. Richard's face colored with anger, breaking through the mask of respectability, and he said, "That woman is my wife, married legal and proper. You have no right to keep her." And Jacob said, "She's not kept. She's here by choice. Made that choice 3 months ago when she damn near died running from you. And if you try to take her by force, you'll find out how serious I am about protecting people under my roof." The 2 hired men shifted uneasily, hands near their guns, but not quite willing to draw on a man with a rifle already in his hands, and the standoff stretched out tense and brittle. Eleanor appeared in the doorway behind Jacob, her hand on his shoulder, and she looked at Richard and felt nothing. No fear and no residual attachment. Just distant pity for the small, angry man who'd thought he could own another person's soul. Richard saw the look on her face, saw the way she stood behind Jacob without fear, saw that whatever hold he'd had was gone, broken by months of peace, and he understood that he'd lost. He opened his mouth to say something, but Jacob raised the rifle slightly, just enough to make the message clear, and Richard jerked his horse around and rode away, his hired men following, and none of them looked back.
Eleanor watched them go and felt something lift from her chest. Some weight she'd carried for years, finally releasing. And she leaned against Jacob's shoulder and said, "Thank you." And he said, "You saved yourself when you walked out into that storm. I just gave you a place to land." Jacob and Eleanor married that summer in a simple ceremony, with just the circuit preacher and a few neighboring ranchers as witnesses. And Eleanor took Jacob's name and became Eleanor Thorne, and felt the rightness of it, felt like she'd finally found where she belonged. The years that followed were good years. Not easy, because ranch life was never easy, because winters were harsh and summers were hot, and the work never stopped. But good in the ways that mattered, good in the daily work and shared meals, and quiet companionship that deepened into love so strong it became the foundation of everything else. They had 2 children, a boy they named Samuel after Jacob's father, and a girl they named Rose after Eleanor's mother. And Jacob was the kind of father Eleanor had hoped for, patient and present and gentle, showing his children how to ride and work and treat others with respect, teaching by example what it meant to be a good person. Samuel grew up tall and strong, with his father's steady temperament, and Rose was fierce and independent, with a smile that could light up a room. And Eleanor would watch them playing in the yard and feel grateful in a way that was almost overwhelming. Grateful for the life she'd been given after nearly losing everything. Eleanor would sometimes wake in the night and watch Jacob sleeping beside her and marvel at how her life had changed, how close she'd come to dying in that blizzard, and how that near death had led to this, to a life she'd never imagined possible, to happiness that felt almost improbable. She'd think about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, broken and afraid, and running with no plan beyond escape, and barely recognize her, because that woman and this woman felt like different people, separated not just by time, but by transformation. Jacob would tell the story sometimes when visitors asked how they'd met, would tell them about finding a woman dying in a blizzard and carrying her home through conditions that should have killed them both. And Eleanor would add details about waking terrified, and then gradually understanding she was safe, that this stranger expected nothing in return except the chance to help. People would listen and shake their heads in wonder at the improbability of it, at how one decision to stop had changed 2 lives completely. And they'd call it fate or providence. But Jacob and Eleanor knew it was choice, was the decision to stop when stopping seemed foolish, to help when helping wasn't convenient. The ranch prospered modestly, never making them wealthy but providing enough. And Jacob and Eleanor built a life that felt solid and real. And when their children grew up and had children of their own, they'd bring them to visit, and the house would fill with noise and laughter. And Eleanor would watch it all and feel grateful. Years later, when Jacob was old, and his joints ached, and his hair had gone completely white, he would sit on that same porch, where he'd offered Eleanor a permanent place, and watch his grandchildren play. And Eleanor would sit beside him, her hand in his, and they'd watch the sunset together in comfortable silence. Sometimes Jacob would think about that day in the blizzard, about how close they'd both come to dying, about how one storm had brought them together, and he'd feel grateful for every small choice that had to align perfectly. He'd reach over and take Eleanor's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice, and Eleanor would squeeze back, understanding without words, because after 35 years together, they could read each other's thoughts. The story became legend in those mountains, the story of the cowboy who found a dying woman in a blizzard, and the love that grew from that desperate beginning.
and people told it to illustrate different points, some focusing on the rescue and calling it Providence, others focusing on Eleanor's escape and calling it survival. But everyone agreed that Jacob and Eleanor Thorne were proof that sometimes the worst moments led to the best things. And when Jacob died peacefully in his sleep at 78 with Eleanor holding his hand, she sat with him for a long time after his breathing stopped, remembering the man who'd saved her life and then given her a reason to live it. And she understood that everything good in her life had flowed from that moment, from that one act of mercy extended by a man who could have ridden past but stopped instead. Eleanor lived 5 more years after Jacob died, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the house they'd built together, and when she finally followed him, she was buried beside him on the hill, overlooking the valley where wildflowers grew in summer. The marker said simply, "Jacob and Eleanor Thorne, together through storm and sunshine," because that captured everything that mattered. A love born in crisis and sustained through decades. A love that proved mercy and courage, and the willingness to help strangers could create something that transcended circumstances and became something eternal. Something that echoed forward through generations as proof that even in the hardest moments, even when death seems certain and hope seems naive, sometimes choosing compassion over convenience could save not just one life, but 2. Could create not just survival, but something far more valuable. Could build the kind of love that people talk about for generations afterward. The kind that reminds everyone who hears the story that the best things in life are often born from the worst circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with seeking, but with being found. Not with strength, but with vulnerability. Not with having all the answers, but with being willing to take a chance on someone who needs help, even when helping them might cost you everything.